I'm Rob Moore.
And I'm Li Bai.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.
What are we looking at today, Rob?
This is part 2 of our Tang Dynasty Greatest Hits series. Last time was Du Fu, and this time is Li Bai.
And we're looking at a particular Li Bai poem. This
Yes.
is a very famous poem. This is Yue Sha Du Zhou,
Which would be roughly translated as what?
Drinking Alone Beneath the Moon.
And this is a prototypical Li Bai title. Drinking Alone in the Moonlight.
This is the prototypical Li Bai poem in some ways. There's one that I would say is more famous.
Yeah.
But this is really got it all. It's the greatest hit of the greatest hits.
You know, this is the most famous, or one of the most famous, and certainly the one that contains the themes that you need to understand Li Bai. So we're doing this as part 2. Part 1 was Du Fu, and we read a poem that is going, as the listener will see in a second, is vastly different from this one in terms of content and style. So set us up to kind of compare them. What was the Du Fu poem about, and how did he go about executing it?
The Du Fu poem was about the An Lushan Rebellion, which occurred in 756, I believe, and it's a poem supposedly depicting Du Fu running into one of the emperor's children in the area outside of the destroyed Chang'an. And there are lots of, we talked about it as a historical poem, but I think we also problematized that historicalness. He's just talking really about current events. He doesn't yet think of them as historical. They're just things that he's thinking of. But there's, this highly elusive nature to all of these different current events. And when you're reading it, if you don't know what those allusions are, it kind of comes off as maybe sad and problematic, but not all that meaningful. I think one of the big things that makes Li Bai different is he tends to be much less elusive, or allusion is not as necessary to understanding his poetry as someone like Du Fu.
Right, and Du Fu, his poem does not ground the reader, possibly because when he wrote it, of course, these events were all very well known.
Right.
His reference in the beginning of the poem to white-headed crows, we read that as crows and think, well, that's a symbol of death. But it was at the time a specific reference.
It was a reference to, I believe, one of the Six Dynasty capitals and non-Chinese invaders attacking that capital.
Now, it's not necessary to know that to appreciate the poem, but to truly understand what it's talking about, it is pretty necessary, as is necessary to understand something about the An Lushan Rebellion now, to know, well, why is he running into this prince? Where is the rest of the family? Why is he afraid for his life?
If you're reading Du Fu without that particular Du Fu poem, without understanding the An Lushan Rebellion, you're going to be lost.
And there are many Du Fu poems like that. I would even say the majority of the ones I've read anyway are like that. Now,
says Scholar Rob,
who has read everything in the world. That's me. But Li Bai. Would you agree with me that Li Bai is probably the more popular poet?
Yeah, absolutely. I like him a lot more, and every time when I talk to Chinese people, they'll always tell me Du Fu is the best, but Li Bai is my favorite.
Yeah, exactly. It's a good way to put it. Because Du Fu is the master of the poetic forms that anyone in that era was working with. But Li Bai, like you said last time, Li Bai is the one you'd want to have a beer with. Yeah. Like, if you were going to sit down and talk about literature and life, Li Bai would be your guy.
Though, to be fair, I don't think you could just have one beer with Li Bai.
You would not.
He's going to drink you under the table.
No. And let's get into that. Let's go ahead and read the poem so we can situate ourselves.
Awesome.
This is a translation that we worked on earlier.
This is Rob Moore's very own translation, copywritten.
That's right. Although I seriously doubt anyone's going to want to quote from this. But so the Du Fu poem's translation was Li's, and the Li Bai poem is mine. So this one is Drinking Alone in the Moonlight. A pot of ale among the flowers. I drink alone without companions. I raise a glass to toast the bright moon, and with my shadow we become 3. The moon doesn't understand drinking, and my shadow just follows my movements. These temporary partners, the moon and the shadow, we enjoy the spring together for a while. My song paces about the moon, and my dance flickers about my shadow. When we are awake, we take our pleasures together, and after I am drunk, we part. Forever I travel, bound with these things, and we will set a date to meet together in the Milky Way.
Fantastic.
Yeah, it's a really striking poem, and it's striking in a way that's far more accessible than what Du Fu is doing.
What makes this poem so striking?
Well, for me, one of the things is the obvious melancholy and loneliness, and it's a universal kind of melancholy. I don't really have anyone with whom I would want to share my life. Not that there's no one around me, but there's no one significant around me. This is why he's drinking alone, without companions. But again, someone like Li Bai, if you know anything about his biography, the man had companions.
Yeah.
If he had anything, he had companions. Why write about this? Because even with companions, there are times when he realizes it's not going to work. Something is missing.
I guess for the English reader, it makes me think a lot of the sort of romantic poets, the English romantics of the 19th century. Yeah. There's this kind of fetishization of being alone, of getting, I guess the English romantics weren't so big about getting drunk, but there is a touch of the sublime.
I think where I would contrast with that is that at least in this poem, Li Bai is not on any level romanticizing being alone. In fact, it's a little bit the opposite. In fact, what intrigues me most about Li Bai's poetry is he doesn't position himself on one or the other side. He doesn't romanticize being alone, but neither does he lament it. Here, he simply is alone. And because it's a beautiful poem, and because he already has his liquor with him, he's not completely sad. It's a kind of wistful melancholy.
I disagree with you on one point. I think that this is sort of romanticizing the fact that he is alone. I think that there's something going on there with the way he is imagining himself as three separate people. I don't know that it's sad. I find it kind of pleasant. He doesn't really give us any sort of thing to suggest this is sad or not sad. But the way I read this, it seems like he's enjoying himself. Now, maybe that's just because I am a romanticist. I think we're all romanticists now. But I don't know. Does that sound right?
It does, but I think that's closer to my point, though, that it's neither romanticization or lamentation.
Okay.
There's something about this poem where he seems to enjoy drinking, but he's also kind of making fun of his drinking companions. You have a line like...
Well, he's making fun of himself.
As well, but he's making fun of a little bit of all three. The moon doesn't understand drinking, he says, and my shadow just follows my movements. He's basically... You're right, he's making fun of all three. One, the moon doesn't understand what I'm doing. My shadow just copies whatever I do, which of course then implies, well, then why are you drinking with them in the first place if they're like this?
And I mean, it's a playful way of suggesting he's not actually drinking with... He's using the language of partying with people without actually having any other people. He's assigning this sort of subjectivity to them without them actually having it, right?
Right.
Which is, it's just funny, right?
Yeah.
And it's a lot of fun too. I mean, I can imagine myself in Tang Dynasty China reading this and just also wanting to get wasted alone.
And this is part of Li Bai's enduring legacy. There was an old tradition that he never wrote a poem unless he had at least one drink first.
Really?
That's the story. I mean, who knows if it's actually true. It's probably just a part of the legend. But what's important to bring in here is that Li Bai is roughly a contemporary of Du Fu. They're not literally writing at the same time. Well, they are in some places. Like Du Fu has a poem lamenting Li Bai, for example, and vice versa. So they're roughly contemporary, which means they both lived through the Anlushan rebellion. In fact, Li Bai came off slightly worse than Du Fu. And yet, if you look at their collection, Li Bai's poems tend much more towards the... I'm going to use a really fancy English word, the Bacchic, this celebration of drink and song, and whereas Du Fu is heavier.
Yeah. I guess that's why he gets the sort of gets tagged as the historical.
Yeah, as the important poem. Because everybody knows if you're writing sad poems, you're good. And if you're writing happy poems, you're not. So,
yes. I'm not going to quote Tolstoy.
Please don't.
So I want to bring up two terms that we haven't yet brought up in this podcast. We touched on them in the last podcast. That's Confucianism and Taoism. Now, we should have a big warning label. Confucianism may or may not exist, depending on who you ask. And Taoism may or may not exist before 200 AD or something like that. So we're talking about terms and we're using them quite glibly, but we should be questioning them as much as we should be using them. But I'm going to go ahead and use them for the sake of simplicity.
Right.
But one thing that I think Du Fu is when he's talking about history, he seems to be talking about sort of duty, obligation. And that poem that we read for the last podcast was definitely talking about duty and obligation and one's role in historical processes. Mm-hmm. There's none of that here, right?
No.
There's something very, I don't even want to call it Taoist. Let's call it Taoist-y.
Yeah, I know what you mean. Finish your point.
Well, I mean, my point is that the thing about drinking alone, and this is one of the reasons that I think he's, to a certain degree, romanticizing being alone, is that it's coming out of this long tradition of figures associated with Taoism hanging out just in a secluded place, not doing anything. I think the alcoholism of Li Bai and of this poem are maybe sort of a new addition to that, although I'm not at all a scholar of Taoist thinking. But I think that the alone part is actually something that's very common, and there's a long tradition of these people just going out into the mountains and hanging out and rejecting society. And that's what I see his drinking as, is a rejection of society.
And yet it's interesting because he's also deeply involved in society. So poems like this...
How is he deeply involved in society within the space of this poem?
We're not within the space. Within the space of this poem, I think you're dead right.
Okay.
In the space of his overall corpus, he's kind of all over the map. But you are right that he tends more towards this... when we use a term like Taoist, one of the things we're talking about is a strain in Chinese thought that I guess is fairly romantic in our, as we would think of it, in its makeup, because it's talking about not pursuing formal training and education, simply learning from the way things are, simply finding your way within the Tao, within the way things are. And that is definitely something that Li Bai is drawing on. Whether or not this celebration of alcohol is a part of that, like you said, I don't know. But this is one of the things that makes Li Bai so popular, is his ability to acknowledge a part of the tradition that at least Chinese people or Chinese readers are familiar with, which is the individual alone or the individual apart from formal training, pursuing truth or pursuing the way things are. And yet even then he's breaking out of that. It's like he's going a step beyond even what a good Taoist philosopher would talk about and say, we're not even going to meditate or seek the obvious enlightenment of streams and mountains. We're going to seek at the bottom of a bottle and in revelry.
I guess I would say that is just, I don't know, this is my conception of it, but I think that's more of an extension of Taoist thinking rather than, a kind of a step outside of Taoism.
I think
I think we're making the same point.
We're making a similar point. I think for me, and I probably always will, see this through the lens of the way I'd always heard Li Bai talked about when I was in China.
How was that?
Well, just everyone feels it's kind of like we've already said. This is the guy you want to party with, sit and talk with, and spend time with, because there's something liberating about his poems. This is someone who's able to use the poetic forms of the day expertly, but also kind of explode them, and also explode what people are used to in terms of content. And there's something attractive about that, especially in a society like we talked about in the exam podcast, where things like regulation, containment, duty, training, these are core values, at least core social values. Mm-hmm. So to have a poet that's so well versed in the tradition that he's a master of it, and yet also talks essentially about doing whatever he wants.
He's sort of rejecting those values in some ways. I mean,
can you imagine getting tested
in
those exams over this thing? Like, I mean, just being forced to memorize all of that stuff and then reading this and being like, oh, I want to drink.
Right. And what's amazing, though, what you just said, I wanted to bring that up, but he's rejecting these things, but he's rejecting them through them.
Yeah.
He's rejecting this tradition by using the tradition.
Which necessarily nullifies his rejection to a certain degree, right?
But it's also so attractive. I mean, I'm just putting myself in the mind of someone reading this in China, which obviously, whatever. But
you're putting yourself...
It's a thought experiment.
You're putting yourself in the mind of someone, a Tang Dynasty reader.
Exactly. Or even somebody now. I don't know. I'm just this sort of a thought experiment. But... You're already being trained in how the poetry is supposed to work, how the history and the philosophy are supposed to work, and yet within those confines, this is someone who's essentially saying, "But I'm not going to do that. I'm done with that." And so there's something deeply attractive about that.
But that's definitely a Taoist move, like just to be like, you know what, to heck with it.
It's true. So perhaps it's almost a Taoist response within a Confucian framework.
Maybe.
This is getting
we're getting way too complicated, and we're using terms we don't even know what they mean.
Know.
Let me ask you something. So we've said that Li Bai is the more popular of this pair. How much of his popularity is due to the fact that he's just a great sort of party trick that you can pull out when you're with your friends and y'all are all drinking, which is very popular in China.
Yes.
And you can just drop some Li Bai and your social esteem, your social position goes way up.
I hadn't thought about that, but that is, I can imagine that being part of it. I mean, yeah, if you're drinking with Chinese people, if you're drinking seriously with Chinese people, and you break out some Li Bai, your cultural cachet goes way up, for sure.
Absolutely.
I've never actually dropped Li Bai
really?
Like that. Have you?
I think once or twice, yeah.
Do people get raised eyebrows around the table?
Yeah.
Look at the Lao Wai with his Li Bai knowledge. Yeah.
That's good.
I suppose a parting thought I would have is for the listener, and a lot of these podcasts, if not all of them, are geared towards people who are not specialists in Chinese literature. That's why we decided to do this. Mm-hmm. If you're finding some of these things interesting, or if you're going to China even, do yourself a favor and read some commentaries and some poetry by Li Bai and Du Fu.
Absolutely.
And keep those in your mind, because these two figures represent, as we said in the Du Fu podcast, two different strains of Chinese social values, social hopes, whatever, that are pervasive and still are pervasive today. And understanding, really getting into these poems will seriously, and I'm not just hyping the humanities here, seriously give you a very effective lens to use when you're in China.
And I mean, just for those listeners who are learning Chinese, I don't think it would be such a bad idea to memorize this poem and just drop it at certain strategic points when you're getting drunk with your friends. And I think it will help you make a lot of friends and yeah.
So I'm Rob Moore.
And I'm Lee Moore, and we're raising a glass. Ganbei.
Ganbei. This is the Chinese Literature Podcast.